Welcome to Collision, the podcast where we discuss the fun and sometimes complicated collision of real life and trusting God. If you're curious or confused about how to engage the world we live in, we hope our conversation here helps. Now, let's get into this episode of Collision.
Well, welcome to the Collision podcast. I'm Matt Manning, the senior pastor at Crossroads Church, and I am here with my cowboy co-host, Stu Jackson. How you doing today, Stu?
I'm doing great. Just trying to keep things, just a little bit off and keep you on your toes.
Well, off is a good way to put it. Off's a good way to put it. So you've been vacationing like all summer.
It feels that way.
Do you have a job?
Do I have a job? That depends on who you talk to.
Okay.
My boss seems to think I still do. So,
okay.
Hey, I'm good.
So you're good to go.
Absolutely.
Good. So it's been a while, but we get to sit down, and today we are going to talk about the Middle East. And so you wanted to talk about that, and so I said, okay, let's do it.
Now, my Middle East is like the Carolinas. Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly where I was going to go with that. Yes, that is the Middle East that I had in mind. So, if you aren't living under a rock, the Middle East is what's the right word?
The hotbed of the world.
Hotbed of the world right now, yes. And so very recently, negotiations and peace talks broke down between Israel and Iran when it comes to nuclear weapons and who should have what. And that date passed. And so Israel thought it was in their best interest not to allow Iran to have nuclear weapons. Indeed. And so they threw some bombs that way at military sites, of which Iran obviously was not very appreciative of. And so they threw missiles at Tel Aviv and hit residential sites and everything else, which has only escalated everything.
They keep throwing stuff back and
now
forth,
they're throwing missiles back and forth. Now, ironically, in all of this is last year, we were planning to go to Israel this summer. And the plane that I would have been on would have landed 3 hours before Israel decided to bomb Iran. And we would have been scheduled to be in Tel Aviv when the missiles from Iran came. And so I woke up that week feeling pretty prophetic that I had decided last November not to go to Israel.
I got to give you points on that one.
Yeah.
That was probably a good thing.
Yeah, well, at the beginning of May, when everything seemed to be settled and all right, I thought to myself, man, maybe I pulled the trigger a little too early and called off that trip. Maybe we should have gone. And then watching what has recently unfolded, like I said, I felt pretty prophetic.
I know you always focus on life experiences and, things that to bring you closer to God. And I can only imagine sitting in a bomb shelter as ballistic missiles are being lobbed in at you would bring you closer to God.
There would be a lot of that. And I can't imagine if I was responsible for 30 other people in a situation like that. And so God's blessing, at least upon me in that. But we wanted to talk about really kind of the events that are going on. And, part of that is, geopolitical. There's a whole nother part of just the heartbreak of these are real people with real lives that are being lost as two nations are going at it. And there's a lot of innocent victims that have been caught in the crossfire of all of that. And so as we kind of just walk through this, we want to just take kind of an honest approach of what it looks like, particularly from the church, as we think through this. And so, we have, as a church, have had a lot of experience in the Middle East. We have a whole initiative in terms of missions to Lebanon, specifically amongst the Syrian refugee crisis that's happening there for close to 30 years now. We've taken regular trips every couple of years to Israel. We have a lot of friends in Israel. We have a lot of friends in Palestine because of those trips that we've taken there. We support a missionary organization that actually sends missionaries into Arab worlds that Americans could never get into, places like Iraq and Iran. And so we have a lot of history in the Middle East as a church in particular, of serving there, of ministering there, of bringing the gospel, the hope of Jesus there. And so in light of all of that, maybe one of the questions out there is that when it comes to what's going on in Iran, which is a Muslim country run by Ayatollah.
Primarily.
Yeah. What is the Christian response to all of this, particularly when it comes to Israel, Iran? How are you, maybe just put it into, what does Stu think? What is the going on in the mind of Stu with all of this conflict happening?
That's never been asked before. What's going on in the mind of Stu? Just letting you know. Even my wife and kids don't ever ask that question.
That's not a question
that's
as
a
often
dangerous
asked.
world. And I'll be completely upfront. I am not a geopolitical expert by any stretch. I certainly enjoy my history. I find it kind of ironic that part of the reason that Iran is the way it is because of the United States. And just a little, tangent because, hey, why keep it on the page? Doug's back behind the camera, freaking out right now as our producer. But
Stu's going off.
He's like, oh, again. But back in the 50s, in the 1950s, there was a top secret CIA program called Operation Ajax. And it was actually run by Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit, which where's that name in our world?
Yes.
Seriously.
Yeah, that one has passed out.
I cannot believe it. I want to meet one of the teenagers whose name is Kermit. That would be great.
I think it happened when Kermit the Frog.
Might have.
A little bit, it went the way of Jezebel.
Yeah, may have. But anyways, he was tasked as a CIA agent chief or whatever to figure out how to depose a prime minister in Iran that had been elected that was very popular. And at the time, the U.S. and other Western powers were getting all of their oil money from there. They were making big bucks. Oil is that's where the money is.
Yeah.
And this prime minister came in and started nationalizing all of the oil in Iran, which of course may have bothered the Western powers who were getting all their money. So the CIA came in and decided that the prime minister needed to go, and they were going to prop up the Shah of Iran.
Yeah.
Well, it all went down, whole story. It's a really fascinating moment in history. Well, it ends up that the CIA was successful, kicked the prime minister out, had the Shah, fire him essentially. And then 20 years later, the Shahs of Iran were overthrown by the people who were so upset by the way things were being controlled by Western powers.
Yeah.
And here we are today with an Ayatollah and all of the influences that have come around that and the hatred for Western countries.
Yeah.
So, you look at all that and just the whole thing, to me, it's scary. I'll be honest. It's kind of scary because there is such emotion. It's not a logical type of argument.
Yeah.
This is land we owned. You took it. We want it back.
Yeah, right.
This
so on
is,
and so forth.
When you start talking about holy war and, people that don't like your existence, it's not that Israel, when the UN created Israel, or it wasn't the UN, it was the precursor to that. But when Israel was created, that was a big uproar, right?
Yes.
But it wasn't really Iran that it took, took land from or anything. And so it's not a traditional war per se. It's more of it could be almost considered a spiritual war. It's the religions that are really kind of fighting it against each other. So that scares me as a Christian because you look at it and from a Christian perspective, I don't want to see anybody die.
Yeah.
I don't want to see these guys lobbing missiles at each other. I don't want to see the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen what that does.
Real right now.
Oh, absolutely it is. Because the people with their fingers on the triggers are the ones the zealot that you just don't know what state of mind they're in.
Yeah.
And if they push the button, do they think about the consequence?
Yeah.
No, it's I won, boom.
Yeah.
And so it's just, from a Christian perspective, I don't want to see people die. And I understand both sides in the fight for what you believe in, but I have to ask the question: why can't you two sit down?
Yeah.
and have a conversation about it. But that's asking 2,000 years of hatred to be solved in an afternoon of sitting around a table with interpreters. It's just not going to happen.
We have the Hatfield and the McCoys, right? In American history of like the war that happened there. This is like thousands of years of Hatfield and McCoys, right? Of building up. And so we want to talk about both kind of countries and what's the Christian perspective to them. And so maybe we'll start with Iran and then talk a little bit about Israel. And so when it comes to Iran, Iran's government is basically a Islamic theocracy. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that at least is being asked by Christians is, should we be praying or wanting to see a regime change happen in Iran, which is a little bit of a loaded question, but how would you begin to answer that? What would be your thought? Should we as Christians be praying for the regime to go away?
Sure. And those of you that are curious, that noise you just heard is the bus, the horn from the yellow bus that just ran me over, asking me these questions. Right. I should be like, hey, Matt, what do you think about that? That'd be a lot easier. But
if you weren't just the co-host, if you were the host, you could have asked me. But
I need to talk to somebody about that. So, should we be praying for a regime change? In my opinion, yes. Yeah. I think we should. Yeah. The oppression and Iran does not let its people really flourish, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. In the dictatorial society that Iran is, if you're not in the party of the elites, well, you're not.
Yeah.
And so you have this area of the world where people are just, it's destitute. It's terrible, and no, I do not live there. No, I've never traveled there. No, I haven't really ever talked to anybody from there. However, if you look at the stories and you do some investigation and some work into what's going on in that area of the world, Iran is not a nice place.
Yeah.
And so you have this leader or leaders whose sole purpose, stated purpose, is the destruction of another country.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's time for a change. I think there's a movement to see that change. Mm-hmm. Because in today's world with the flow of information, being a computer nerd, that's something I'm always, really attuned to, is how information flows around. No matter how big of wall they build around Iran, they can't stop all that information coming in.
Right.
So the people of Iran are starting to see their world through a different set of eyes and a different perspective. And I believe are starting to ask questions of why are we living like this? We don't have to.
Yeah, it feels like Iran is almost kind of on the verge of like the Arab Spring, of a decade ago. Where the younger generations are becoming aware of maybe the oppression that they're living under. And I would agree with you. I think that when it comes to the Christian perspective and the Christian worldview, that we are always to be about the flourishing of people. That's a command given to us in Jeremiah chapter 29, that we are to seek the well-being of the cities that we're a part of, and really the greater world that we're involved in. This is the idea of Hebrew shalom, a well-being for all of life. And anytime that we see that kind of a leadership that is diminishing people, that is oppressing people, that's not allowing people to flourish, then I think it's right for us to pray. Now, I think in the regime change, there's a couple of things that we have to realize and think about. We probably shouldn't pray for the violent destruction of Ayatollah.
No,
that's not where we should go. And probably the right perspective for Christians is to pray for a peaceful regime change, and maybe that's a pipe dream, in a world full of sin.
Yeah, but
to be praying for that
are God's thing, right?
Yeah,
that's. We may look at it and say there is no way a peaceful regime change is ever going to happen.
Yeah.
But you just don't know.
Yeah.
Tomorrow is not ours to write.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And yet at the same time, as we pray for that and want to see flourishing, there is a reality that we can see throughout history where the church the faithfulness of the church has been seen in some of its greatest struggles.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's a great a quote from one of the church fathers, Tertullian, that really the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And the idea behind that is that when we really truly understand what the gospel costs us, that the faithfulness of the church is so much stronger. And like I experienced this firsthand, that when I was in Lebanon, one of the opportunities that I had was actually to sit with Iraqi refugees in Lebanon. So I'm sitting in this room, probably not much bigger than like a regular living room in a house, and there's this Bible study going on, and there's these 12 ladies who are all participating in this Bible study. They were studying out of the book of Matthew. They were talking about persecution, and they kept talking about this event that had profoundly shaped their lives. And so I'm listening to all this kind of through an interpreter, trying to understand it. And finally, they asked, if we had any input. And I just asked the question, like, what is this event that you keep all referring to? And what they were referring to was the shock and awe of the United States and the bombing that happened in Iraq that ultimately toppled Hussein. And as I sat there was this moment of like, wow, what my country did to another country ultimately led to a greater persecution for this group of women because of who they were in Iraq, right? The sect that they were a part of, which ultimately led to their displacement, where now they're living literally with 3 families in a house that was no larger than 800 square feet. And it was like, regardless of what you believe, whether we should have been involved in Iraq or not, as the United States, there was this heaviness that was all of a sudden on me. And the lady looked at me and she said to me that while she would never wish that upon her greatest enemy, that she was thankful that it happened to her because it brought her closer to Jesus. And like in that moment, I was like, who am I?
How do you respond to that?
Who am I to sit in the company of spiritual giants?
Right.
Right.
That's when you say, excuse me, I have to go to the bathroom, and then you cry your heart out.
Oh man, it was just, I'll never forget that moment. Right. And so like, there is this prayer that the regime changes there. And yet at the same time in my own life, there's this prayer that even in the midst of the suffering, that the church would grow strong in Iran.
Sure.
And that if the church ever is able to find its freedom, right, and truly flourish, that it wouldn't go the way of the United States, which is a lot of apathy.
Yeah. People just tolerate Christianity. They're like, yeah, okay.
Yeah. And so I look at that and I see that and how that change would impact the church there. And so there's this dual prayer for me, right? Like, God, strengthen the church, allow it to flourish, be with it in its suffering. And yet at the same time, Lord, I pray that this regime change would change, so that the people of Iran can truly find flourishing, which, speaking, is not too much different than my prayer for Israel. And so
sure.
we can shift to Israel. And I would say that in the course of this conflict, that one of the great questions, or one of the common questions that has come to me, is like, what's the difference between today's Israel and the Israel of the Bible?
Absolutely.
Which is,
and I have seen that question, and attempts to answer that question, and very recently, and it's the Israel of the Bible.
Yes.
Is not the Israel nation today.
Yeah. The nation state of Israel today is very much different than what we see the Israel in the Bible, right? Like when the way that somebody asked me it this week was, what is the difference between the chosen nation of God, the Hebrew people, and the people of God, which is the church?
Right.
And I was like, man, that's a really good question.
That's a good question and a very tough question.
Yeah. And so the way that I answer that is that when we read through the scriptures, we see that the nation of Israel was called to be the chosen of God, and that really as a nation, that they were to be a nation of priests, which meant that through their holy living, that they would be the witness to the world that Yahweh was real, that through their holy living, that people would see that Yahweh was worth following, and that ultimately their very presence on this earth would draw the nations around the earth to the true God. That's the Old Testament.
Right.
That's what we see in Old Testament. And there's this promise throughout the Old Testament of this Messiah who's to come. And so we turn the page to the New Testament. The Messiah in Jesus comes. And what we see is that largely the people of Israel reject Jesus. There's this rejection of him. And that leads to ultimately his crucifixion, which fulfills the Old Testament scriptures. And then ultimately his resurrection, where now this universal purpose of go and make disciples, that we're beginning something new called the church. This is Jesus instituting, right? This thing called the church. And now that the church is this grafting in of Gentiles and Jewish people together to be the people of God, that again is to bring the hope of the gospel to the world in this. And so when we look at who Israel is, like from a very real sense, like the Israel today is for the Jewish people are people who have rejected Jesus.
So let me ask this question, just getting it right in my mind. Yeah. And we know that's a small little space, but
we'll do our best.
So when we talk about church in conversation, you'll talk about big C church, little C church.
Yep.
When somebody says the church, it takes a minute. It's context, right? Mm-hmm. Which church are they talking about? Yeah. Big C church meaning Christians, meaning as a whole, not looking at each little church body.
Yes.
The little C church is the church body.
Yes, the local church.
The local church. Mm-hmm. So and maybe I'm crazy.
Yeah.
Nope, I am crazy. But I think of it as Israel with the little I, and that's the nation state today.
Okay. Yep.
Versus Israel with the big I,
yes.
The intention of what it was going to be in the Bible, the chosen people across the world, all of the believers being part of the big I Israel, or big C church.
Yep. Maybe the way that you would maybe hear it is like, what is true Israel?
Sure.
You know, that true Israel is the ones, both Gentile and Jews, who have put their faith in Jesus and are following him as his disciples. That would be what we would refer to as true Israel, or, the church in that. And, so we see like in Romans chapter 9 and even into 10, where Paul is basically pleading for us to pray for Israel because it has rejected its salvation.
Sure.
It has rejected its Messiah. And so like when it comes to Israel, that there's still in kind of biblical history, that there's this specialness to Israel, and that we as the church are to be praying for Israel. We're to be praying for the Jewish people who have rejected their Messiah, that their eyes would be open and they would come to know Jesus. And yet at the same time, today, the nation state of Israel is as godless as the Muslim theocracy of Iran. Like they're in the same category. Neither of them are following Jesus. They're both in need of salvation. They both need to be prayed for. And yet there's also this like tension and real reality that in biblical history, in redemptive history, that there is a special place for Israel at the end in Revelation. And as the original chosen of God. And so like we put all of this together, and really from a Christian worldview right now, like we are to pray for Israel, that we're to pray for their salvation, that we're to pray for their leaders, and that their leaders would wake up and they would see Jesus, much in the same way that we would pray for Iran's leaders to wake up and to see Jesus.
I'll be honest. I think praying for all the world leaders to wake up and see Jesus would not be a terrible thing to think about.
It would not,
because it's such. And the more we talk about it, it's that big I concept.
Yeah.
Or the true Israel. We're supposed to pray for Israel. And again, not a biblical scholar. Just a schmo off the street. That's why Matt brought me in. I don't really. If you haven't watched the first episode, he covered that pretty clearly. But we talk about that as the salvation of Israel and the recognizing of God and doing all those things. The more you say that, it's like, wow, maybe we're not just talking about the Middle East. We're talking about the whole thing.
Yeah, no, that's really, I think that's right on. And I think that when it comes to like the Christian perspective on Israel, we get it a little bit skewed, because in the Christian, at least in American Christianity, very rarely does Israel do any wrong.
Right.
Like
Oh, no,
whatever
absolutely.
Israel does, they're the people of God, and that there's this kind of this pass,
Sure.
that they get. And the reality is that's not quite the way that the way that the Bible unveils it to us. And so I think that when it comes to Israel, we pray for them. They don't get a pass. And I think the other side of that, when it comes to the way that the American church looks at Israel, is that there is a bit of, as Doug Schmidt, our producer, would say, a bit of love when it comes to the Middle East and it's being in war. Because I think the evangelical church as a whole sees that when the Middle East is in conflict, then biblical prophecy is being fulfilled and the end times are near and Jesus is going to come back.
Right. Yeah,
And
because
so
God's coming when Jesus is going to come walking in, and he's gonna smite them all. Here it comes.
right.
And when things are, just going crazy, hey, we're closer.
Yeah, and when
Absolutely.
Israel's at peace, there's like this anxiousness of like, oh man, Jesus is far away. And I don't think that either of those are quite the way that we should look at it, is that ultimately, again, we go back to what you said earlier, that we want to see people who flourish. We want
Absolutely.
Israel to flourish. We want Iran to flourish. And so we want peace, and we want peace everywhere. And God's going to work out end times. He's going to work out the eschatology of how all that comes, and He's going to come when he comes, and we should be vigilant in watching
It'd sure be
for
nice
that.
to get his project plan, just a couple of the dates, so we know when all this is going to go down. And that sure would feel a lot better,
So we can plan a little bit.
Because just imagine if this is the start of the growth of Christianity in that region.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the map, and you can find all kinds of maps. You can find a map for anything you want out there.
Yeah.
Just ask the internet. But if you look at a map of Christianity in that area of the world, it's pretty barren.
Yeah.
There's not a lot. The seeds that have fallen on the ground out there are struggling to grow because there's just not a lot there.
Yeah, percentage-wise, there are more Palestinians who are believers than there are Jewish people who are believers, right? Which kind of messes with your mind, because we're taught that the Palestinians are bad.
Right? Absolutely.
Arabs are bad, right? Jews are good. And yet the reality is that we have more brothers and sisters in Christ with Palestinians than we do brothers and sisters in Christ who are Jewish. And that's certainly true also of Iran. And so, there is a whole harvest field, right, where Jesus makes the comment in Matthew chapter 9 that, the harvest is ready, right? The harvest is great, but the laborers are few. And, I think that's a good perspective of, despite the conflict that is happening, what if in God's redemptive plan that this is a awakening in the Arab world to who Jesus is?
Well, going back to the sermon series that's going on right now, he took a tax collector.
Yeah.
The lowest of the low.
Yep.
And he made him a disciple.
Yeah.
What if he's taking this predominantly Islamic area and maybe this is the time.
Yeah. And I've seen it. I saw it firsthand. I've been to Lebanon a number of times. They're working with the Syrian refugee crisis, and a large number of Syrians are Islamic. That's what they are. And there is this great awakening that is happening among the Syrian people who are coming to the gospel because they realized, one, that the Syrian government was never for them, and that Islam, the God of Islam, is not there for them. Islam is not meeting them. And yet the people who are serving them, the people who are sacrificing for them are the believers. And for the first time in history, right, like we see this awakening among the Muslims. And the Muslims have always been the hardest. The Muslim woman's always the hardest person to reach because she's always behind a barrier, right? She's either behind the door, right? She's not coming out into public. And when she is, she's completely veiled. And what the Syrian refugee crisis has what's happened there is that there's been this great displacement of humanity, the greatest since World War II. And in that displacement, the Muslim woman's moved into the public space and she's seeing Jesus for the first time and she's going, yes, that's what I want.
Right.
And so there's this awakening that's happening, and like tens of thousands of Muslim women, largely, also men, are coming to faith in Jesus because the church is there and Jesus is true and there's compassion and empathy and grace and mercy, and they're seeing that for the first time. And just maybe this is what begins to happen both in Israel for the Jew and in Iran for, the Muslim, that maybe this opens their eyes. And that's what we pray for.
All right, let me go off the script again.
All right. We just have a few minutes left.
Well,
So
that's fine.
your script has to be fast.
It's on you, so you have to summarize. It's awesome. So you talk about all these Syrian refugees and everybody having the opportunity to see what Christianity is and starting to come to faith in Christianity. As a Joe Schmo, as a guy in a church who, I will be honest, probably would never make a great missionary.
Yeah.
But I know there are people out there that can do that. Nathan Dankers, going across the globe to go fly airplanes is one that just recently was commissioned by the church. But as a regular guy, as a normal person in a church, if I said, Matt, how can I support that mission? Yeah. How can I help reach those Syrian refugees? What would your answer be?
Yeah. So I would say there's a couple of things. One is the very simplest thing that we can do is pray. And it is so simple. And yet the reality is how many people are actually praying for the Muslim world in a way that brings about flourishing, right? Like at a very small level, like as a people who are called to pray, that's what we can do. And then for the majority of us, the reality is that you and I could never go into Syria. We couldn't. The color of our skin,
no,
and that we're Americans, we would never make it in.
Even with my cowboy hat on, you don't think they'd be like, hey, he's
even
all right.
Worse, right? And, we, because of the attitude, right, of leadership in Iran, we would never be welcomed into Iran.
No, absolutely not.
And so, so the reality is, even if we couldn't go, that's not a reality for us. But there are people who are, and so, for example, through our missions, we support something called Enduring Love. And Enduring Love is a missions organization that is sending people who have come out of these countries, so people from Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, just name your place in the Middle East, Egypt, Morocco, that they have come out to be trained as church planters, and then they are supported and they're sent back into their countries, which means they don't have to learn the culture, they don't have to learn the language, and there is no American prejudice, against it. And they're able to go far deeper and have way greater impact than you and I could ever have. And when it comes to that ministry, Crossroads is supporting that ministry. And so when you say, hey, how can I be a part of that? Your faithfulness in giving enables the Crossroads to go, we're going to support that missions program, and we're going to do it. And if you wanted to know more about Enduring Love, you can just go check it out, Enduring Love. Just do a Google search. You'll find it there. And you can give individually to Enduring Love. But those are the people who are on the ground as missionaries in these countries doing amazing things. And so in America, we might not have the ability to go, but what God has blessed us with is enormous wealth, right? Even the poorest American is richer than 90% of the world. And for us to be able to go, hey, this is what God's given to me, and I'm going to be generous and use this to support people who are bringing the gospel into places that I'll never bring, is in and of itself a great act of faithfulness that we could do.
Absolutely. And the important thing to note is every little bit helps.
Yep.
And that's, people forget that sometimes, is that, I don't have that much. You know what? Everything helps.
Yep. It all does. So last final words.
I just want to put a shout out to all you people who are watching on YouTube, Spotify, and listening on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Exactly 0 of you clicked the like button. I want to just thank you for that. Appreciate it. Makes it a lot easier to share. I'll be honest, I actually saw the numbers for podcasts, the statistics of who we're reaching, and it's slowly crawling. So everybody out there, I'm asking, share this, get the word out, and we just want to reach people. We want to talk to people and just meet them where they are. So please hit the like button. If you're feeling a little bit, kind of just feeling energized, and make a comment too. That'd be fun. Just
Yeah,
and you don't
actually-
have to say anything important. Just you can write the word comment and hit enter, and I'd love to see it. So
There you are. That's a simple ask.
simple ask. We'll see if it happens.
Yeah.
I don't. My faith in the like button has failed considerably this month. This is the challenge to our listeners.
There's hope out there. There's hope for you.
There's
yeah.
hope.
And if you're looking for a church, you can find us online at crossroadsabc.com. If you're in the North Metro Denver area and you want to check us out, just make your way over to Thornton. We meet every Sunday. Every Sunday. 8:30, 10, 11 o'clock. And so, man, we hope you have a great week, and we will catch you next month when we do this all again.
Sounds good. Thanks
for
Matt.
joining, Stu.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Collision. This podcast is a production of Crossroads Church in Thornton, Colorado. For more excellent content, please visit crossroadsabc.com.